Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the Dagestan War of 1999 to 2000. Here is the wild part. This was not some massive world war with famous generals and movie scenes. It was a relatively short, mountainous conflict that most people outside the region barely remember, and yet it helped light the fuse for a new era of Russian politics, security, and war. On this map, I want you to picture the North Caucasus like a tight corridor of steep terrain and tight communities, where borders look clean on paper but reality is messy, personal, and local. And on this little timeline from August 1999 into the following months, we are going to track how a sudden incursion and a fast-moving response turned a regional shock into a national turning point. We will unpack why this conflict mattered far beyond Dagestan, how a small spark can become a political wildfire, and how moments like this can reshape what a state thinks it is allowed to do in the name of order. If you have ever wondered how governments convert crisis into legitimacy, how wars get framed before the facts even settle, or how ordinary people in a small place can unexpectedly become the hinge of history, you are in the right video. So let me ask you a provocative question right at the start. What if one of the most important wars for understanding modern Russia was not the one everyone talks about, but the one that quietly made the next war feel inevitable? Before we get lost in names and battles, let's pin down the big idea of this slide, because it is the key to everything that follows. The Dagestan fighting was short, but it changed incentives, and once incentives change, history starts moving differently. Think of it like tipping a chessboard. The pieces are the same, but the whole game becomes chaos, and whoever manages that chaos can rewrite the rules. The conflict begins with an incursion into Dagestan in August 1999, and then we see a rapid federal escalation that soon reaches beyond Dagestan and into Chechnya later that year. So why does that matter? Because a local clash became a national turning point, not only in military terms, but in political and institutional terms. Here is the causal chain I want you to hold in your head like a simple machine. First, the incursion creates a legitimacy shock, meaning the state suddenly has a clear, emotionally powerful story to tell about threat and defense. Second, that shock opens space for policy expansion, because in moments of fear and urgency, people tend to accept powers they would question in calmer times. Third, the conflict becomes a template, a kind of rehearsal, for how the state will fight, communicate, and consolidate control moving forward. And we should be honest here, this is not about assuming secret masterminds behind every decision. Systems do not need villains in capes to produce predictable outcomes. They only need incentives that reward certain choices and punish others. That is why we start with a preview of causes, conduct, spillover, and long-run institutional effects. Because Dagestan is not just a story of bullets and villages, it is a story of how a state responds when its credibility is on the line, how armed movements gamble on local support, and how one moment of crisis can rearrange the relationship between society and power for years afterward. To understand why Dagestan was even possible, we have to step back to the world after 1996, after the First Chechen War, when the region is bruised, unstable, and full of openings that a functioning state would normally close. Picture a building after an earthquake. The structure is still standing, but the wiring is exposed, the locks are broken, and everyone is improvising just to get through the day. In Chechnya, institutions were weak, armed factions competed for authority, and the economy became criminalized in ways that turned violence into a job market. That phrase, violence as a labor market, matters a lot, because when state careers collapse, people do not stop needing income, status, and protection. Those needs get met somewhere else, and in war zones, they often get met through armed groups, smuggling routes, kidnap networks, and informal taxation. Meanwhile, Moscow has its own problem, a credibility and capacity crisis after a costly defeat. If you lose a war, you do not just lose territory or soldiers, you can lose deterrence. Others start asking, will they really respond next time, or will they hesitate again? Now add the region itself as a system. Borders are porous, not just physically, but socially, through kinship ties and local alliances that ignore the lines on maps. Security dilemmas emerge, where every group fears being the only one to disarm, and every actor thinks, if I do not move first, someone else will. So by the late 1990s, you have a combustible mix. Fragmented armed networks searching for momentum, a federal center eager to restore credibility, and a region where governance gaps make bold moves seem possible. In that environment, Dagestan is not an accident. It is a predictable collision between weak institutions, opportunistic armed entrepreneurship, and a state that is primed to seize a moment to reassert control. Now we zoom in on Dagestan itself, because if you only look at outside militants and Moscow, you miss the most important variable in the room, the people who actually live there. Dagestan had real economic stress, especially in rural areas, where unemployment and limited opportunity can make grievance politics louder and more tempting. But here is the crucial point: hardship does not automatically produce a unified separatist movement. Societies do not behave like simple equations where poverty equals rebellion. Dagestan is famously complex, with many ethno-linguistic communities and layered local governance bargains that keep daily life functioning through negotiation, not through one single identity marching in lockstep. That complexity matters because it shapes incentives. If your community's survival depends on local stability and delicate relationships, you do not gamble that away lightly for an outsider's revolutionary project. Add to this a religious contest, where newer Salafi currents competed with established local religious authority, and you get polarization and tension, but still not a single unified front. So what is the implication? Outside militants misread local incentives and identity. They assumed that shared religious language would translate into shared political action, but Dagestan's internal reality was more like a mosaic than a banner. And in a mosaic, people can share some beliefs while fiercely disagreeing about who has the right to rule, who gets to enforce norms, and what kind of future is worth the risk of war. This is why internal fault lines are not just background texture. They decide whether an insurgent project finds oxygen or suffocates. Dagestan's diversity and local political economy created friction against a one-size-fits-all ideological takeover, and that friction becomes a decisive force when the incursion arrives. Alright, now we get to the moment when theory meets action, because in early August 1999, the incursion begins, and the people behind it are not random. The main figures include Shomil Basayev and Ibn al-Khatib, along with allied Dagestani militants, and their objective was ambitious in a way that almost sounds surreal when you say it out loud. They were not trying to win a small skirmish or score a propaganda clip. The operational goal was to seize villages, create a foothold, and trigger a cascading uprising, basically lighting a match in Dagestan and hoping the whole region would catch fire, forcing Moscow into a reaction that could be framed as oppressive occupation. Their messaging strategy reinforced this. They claimed they were liberating people, they used the language of defense and faith, and they aimed to declare an Islamic State-style project in the area. But here is the trap they fell into, and it is a classic trap in revolutionary history. They confused a slogan for a coalition. They assumed that because they could speak in a shared ideological vocabulary, they could command loyalty, and in doing that, they miscalculated local incentives, local identities, and local risk tolerance. You can think of it like a hostile takeover attempt in a company, where an outside actor assumes the employees hate management so much that they will gladly accept any new boss, even one they have never met. But people do not just ask, "Do I dislike the current situation?" They ask, "What is the replacement? What will it cost? And who pays the price if this fails?" In Dagestan, many communities did not see the incursion as liberation. They saw it as outsiders trying to impose a project that would drag their villages into devastation. So on this slide, the key takeaway is the contrast between stated goals and revealed incentives. The stated goal was a sweeping uprising and a new political order. The revealed reality was limited local buy-in, strong community resistance, and a strategic misread that turned a bold gamble into a catalyst for a massive state response. Here is where the story gets really important, because it would be easy to assume that the outcome was decided only by Moscow's firepower, but Dagestan fought back first, and that changes everything. Local militias and police mattered because they provided something federal forces cannot easily manufacture on short notice: legitimacy and local knowledge. Legitimacy is a funny word, but it is basically the difference between people seeing you as a protector versus seeing you as an occupier. If a neighbor you trust says, "We need to defend the village," that call lands differently than when an outsider shows up with ideology and guns and says, "We are here to remake your society." Local defenders also had an information advantage. They understood the terrain, the footpaths, the social networks, and the subtle signs that tell you who belongs and who does not. In counterinsurgency, intelligence is not just satellites and radio intercepts. It is knowing which road a stranger would avoid, which family is likely to hide someone, which mountain pass is used after dark, and which rumor is actually a warning. So when we say Dagestan fought back, we are talking about community networks activating into defense, police coordinating with residents, and ad hoc militias forming because people viewed the incursion as a direct threat to home. And once that alignment happens, it creates a powerful feedback loop. The more locals resist, the less the militants can claim popular support. The less support the militants have, the easier it becomes to isolate them. And the more isolated they become, the more their project looks like an invasion rather than a revolution. This is why the slide emphasizes that counterinsurgency often turns on local alignment, not just firepower. You can drop bombs, but you cannot bomb your way into trust. You can seize villages, but if the population sees you as a danger, you are holding territory that does not want to be held. So the major lesson here is that local agency can be decisive. The people living in the target area are not just background characters. They are often the hinge of the whole conflict, because legitimacy and intelligence, in the hands of locals, can frustrate even a well-armed incursion. Now we reach the moment when the federal center fully commits, and this slide is about speed, scale, and the logic behind the response. Moscow escalated quickly, bringing in air power, artillery, and internal security forces, and coordinating across agencies in a way that signaled something very specific. This was not going to be treated as a local disturbance. It was going to be treated as a test of state authority. The operational style you see here is basically a preview of what comes next in the region. First, isolate the area. Cut off movement, pressure supply lines, limit the militants' ability to blend, retreat, or resupply. Second, strike hard, using heavy firepower that can overwhelm positions in difficult terrain. Third, sweep and retake villages, then hold them, at least long enough to prevent the incursion from claiming momentum. That sequence, isolate, bombard, sweep, hold, is simple on paper, but brutal in practice, especially when fighting happens near populated areas and the lines between combatants and civilians are not clean. Now, why the rapid escalation? Because after a costly defeat in the earlier war, deterrence and credibility were on the line. When states feel their authority has been publicly challenged, they often aim for a quick victory that restores the perception of control. It is not only about defeating the enemy. It is about sending a message to everyone watching, inside the region and across the country, that the center will respond, and respond decisively. But that brings us to the trade-off on the slide. Speed and spectacle can increase civilian risk. When the incentive is to win fast and look strong, the temptation is to prioritize visible action over careful restraint. And once heavy force becomes normal, it can reshape expectations inside the security system itself. Units and commanders learn what gets rewarded, and what gets ignored. So this slide is not just military description. It is a glimpse into a governing style. When violence is used as a tool of credibility, it can solve an immediate problem while planting long-term seeds of resentment, fear, and further instability. This slide gets uncomfortable, but it is essential, because it shows how tactical choices can become legitimacy crises. We are talking about thermobaric weapons, sometimes described as fuel-air explosives, which are designed to produce intense blast effects, especially devastating in enclosed spaces. Now, I want to be careful here. The point is not to sensationalize. The point is to understand the strategic and moral consequence of choosing certain tools in certain environments. In village and urban warfare, where people live close together and buildings become part of the battlefield, high blast weapons magnify the risk to civilians. And once civilian harm enters the story, it does not stay a footnote. It becomes part of how the conflict is remembered, narrated, and used politically. Human rights groups warned against using these kinds of weapons in populated areas, precisely because the humanitarian cost can be severe and hard to control. Now ask yourself, even if a tactic is effective in the short run, what does it do to the larger mission? If the state's goal is stability, but the method generates fear, anger, and distrust, does it create the conditions for long-term peace, or does it create a reservoir of grievance that keeps feeding future violence? This is why the slide frames it as a tactical effectiveness versus strategic cost curve. Sometimes the most powerful tool on the battlefield is the one that quietly sabotages the political objective you claim to be pursuing. And in conflicts like this, legitimacy is not optional. It is a resource. It can be earned, spent, and wasted. When weapons choices appear indiscriminate, legitimacy gets spent fast, and the enemy gets a narrative gift. So this controversy is not a side issue. It is a window into how modern states confront insurgency, and how quickly the line between security and coercion can blur when the incentive is to end the problem decisively, even at the cost of turning today's victory into tomorrow's instability. Now we come to the pivot point, where a conflict that begins as a regional incursion starts to expand into something much larger. After Dagestan, the pressure and the strikes do not remain neatly contained. The campaign expands beyond Dagestan into Chechnya, and at that moment the story shifts from a local defense narrative to a national mobilization narrative. This is where framing becomes as important as firepower. When a state says, "This is counter-terror," it is not only describing an enemy. It is building a moral category that reshapes what actions seem justified, what questions seem inappropriate, and what powers seem necessary. And this slide also highlights that the escalation happened alongside a stack of events that altered the political atmosphere, including the apartment bombings of 1999, a topic that remains debated in terms of responsibility, but whose political effect is clearer than the mystery itself. The effect is that fear hardens into demand for decisive action, and uncertainty becomes fertile ground for centralized decision-making. Now, I want you to notice what that means in system terms. Crisis can function like a lever. It allows the center to move institutions that would normally be heavy and resistant. It expands the space for emergency logic, and emergency logic is rarely temporary in practice, because once a government acquires new tools, it tends to find new uses for them. So when we say Dagestan became a turning point, this is one of the reasons. It helped make the next phase feel inevitable, not only militarily, but psychologically and politically. It created a story in which escalation could be sold as restoration. And when restoration becomes the narrative, people often accept costs they would otherwise reject, because the promise is security, closure, and control. But the question, as always, is what kind of control, and at what long-term price? This slide is a reminder that wars do not end when the shooting pauses, because even short conflicts cast long shadows over ordinary lives. When violence flares, people move, and displacement is not just a statistic, it is a rupture of routines, livelihoods, and identity. Tens of thousands fled violence in Dagestan, and then the broader escalation later intensified displacement across the region, pushing large flows of internally displaced people into neighboring areas and strained local systems that were not built for sudden population shocks. Now add another layer that often follows these conflicts: screening practices and the slow spread of collective suspicion. When authorities try to separate militants from civilians, the methods can become blunt. Checkpoints multiply, identity becomes a problem to be proven, and whole communities can be treated as potential threats rather than citizens. That is what the slide is pointing to when it mentions discriminatory restrictions and profiling. Even if a state believes it is acting for security, the lived experience for many people becomes a daily negotiation with power, where movement, work, and dignity are conditional. Humanitarian strain grows fast under these conditions. Housing, food, medical care, schooling, all of it gets stressed, and the social trust that holds communities together starts to thin. So here is the moral question the slide asks, and I want you to sit with it. When does security logic become collective punishment? Because once that line is crossed, even quietly, you create a cycle. Fear produces control, control produces resentment, resentment produces instability, and instability justifies more control. That cycle is one of the most persistent patterns in modern conflict zones, and understanding it is essential if we want to understand not only what happened in Dagestan and the North Caucasus, but why the after-effects linger for years in the politics, the institutions, and the memory of the people who lived through it. Now we shift from human experience back to the architecture of power, because this slide is about what institutions learn, and what they keep. Dagestan helped normalize a model, centralize authority, expand security mandates, and trade civil constraints for control, especially when the public is primed by fear to tolerate it. This is not a claim about a single meeting where someone announces a master plan. It is a system effect. In crises, executives gain leverage, security services gain budgets and jurisdiction, and regional elites often adapt by aligning upward, because their incentives shift toward surviving inside the new order. That is what the principal agent diagram is getting at. The center wants stability and loyalty, security organs want resources and discretion, regional elites want protection and access, and local communities want safety and dignity. But those goals do not align cleanly, and when they clash, the side with coercive tools tends to win in the short term. Then comes the counterinsurgency template: heavy force, tight information control, and sweeping operations aimed at clearing threats quickly. Here is the problem, and it is the heart of this slide: incentive distortion. If institutions start measuring success through short-term metrics like arrests, seizures, and visible crackdowns, they may reward coercion even when coercion damages trust. That is the metrics trap. It looks like progress because numbers go up, but legitimacy quietly goes down. And legitimacy is the thing you cannot replace with paperwork. In the long run, this can produce dependency, where governance relies more on coercive capacity than on consent, and that creates persistent instability risk. You end up managing symptoms through force rather than reducing the conditions that produce conflict, and that is a very expensive way to run a society, financially, morally, and politically. So the lesson here is sharp. Dagestan was not only a war. It was a training ground for institutional habits, and once those habits become normal, they tend to spread beyond the original battlefield, because tools built for emergencies have a way of becoming tools of everyday governance. Alright, let's bring this home, because the Dagestan War is one of those historical hinges that reminds us how quickly systems can rewire themselves under pressure. First, notice what the militants misread. They assumed that ideological language could substitute for local legitimacy, that people would trade their fragile but real community order for an outsider's revolutionary blueprint. But communities do not live in slogans, they live in consequences. Second, notice what states learn in moments like this. Crisis narratives expand capacity. They open the door for centralization, broader mandates, and more coercive tools, and even when the crisis fades, the expanded machinery tends to remain, because it becomes part of how the state understands order. Third, notice the role of local agency, because Dagestan shows that ordinary people, local police, and community networks can disrupt grand projects, whether those projects come from insurgents or from distant capitals. So here are the 3 questions I want you to wrestle with, because they are not just about Dagestan, they are about modern politics everywhere. 1. When does order become a self-sustaining system, where maintaining control becomes the goal rather than protecting people? 2. Can counterinsurgency ever truly succeed without local consent, or does force always create the seeds of the next conflict? 3. What decentralized alternatives actually reduce the demand for coercion in the first place, by making people feel secure, respected, and invested in their own communities? If this video made you see the North Caucasus differently, or helped you understand how a small war can reshape a great power, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you think was the real turning point. Was it the incursion itself, the way the response was framed, or the institutional habits that followed? And if you enjoy thoughtful and entertaining history that digs beneath the surface, explore more videos on truth behind history, because the most important stories are often the ones that history textbooks rush past.